Pues muy buenos días a todas y a todos.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being with us again today on the second day that will close, the third day actually that will close the Trobades Camus. And well, it's very special for us. This edition is indeed very special for all the organizers of the project, but also for you as the audience, because, well, we thank you once more for sharing with us these days for intense debate. Now, we wanted to call this day towards the civilization of dialogue, and we want to feed this idea of Camus that in order to have dialogue, well, the key is to understand each other. So we're going to kick off the day with this dialogue between Phéline and Mathieu around the idea of this, meeting the other. And this meeting the other is at the very heart of the reflection by Camus. Thank you. You have the floor. Good morning, everybody. I would like to start by doing a little bit more and a little bit better than just thanking. Well, of course, it's imposed that I have to thank as a speaker. It is indeed, I can say from the deepest of my heart, how grateful I feel towards all of you, because you're going to allow me to participate in this dialogue that you have already been organizing for years. And this gratitude, well, I would like to say how thankful I am for those who have really relied on me to take the floor today. Agnès, Michel, Sandra. Before we start, I would not like to extend myself in this preamble. I would just like to say how thankful I am, and that I totally agree with what my interlocutor says about the gratitude that I feel. So, and now I'll give the floor to Christian again. Okay, so in our discussion this morning, when I have felt supported and stimulated, maybe in an involuntary way, for the choice of the programmers to change the title of our intervention a little bit, to change the title of our dialogue. Because at the beginning, not so long ago, it was about the difficult dialogue. And well, this is just a remark that highlights the state of the world we live in right now, the state of our society. But it seems to me a little bit pessimistic. It seems to me, talking about the difficult dialogue. So the dialogue is difficult, and this underlines the need for dialogue even more. Because if the dialogue is difficult, it's because it is so necessary to have a dialogue. But, well, yeah. But anyway, we have replaced this title, The Difficult Dialogue, by The Meeting of the Other, which I prefer, actually, because now it seems that we're just receiving the invitation, a commitment, a kind of, a commitment. So the meeting of the other. And maybe it may sound easier to say than easier to do, but at least I think that, we're talking about the other. And this means that we have to cover the space between these two titles, the difficult dialogue and the meeting of the other. And I think that we will cover this space and we will see the scope of the discussion. Yesterday, we were trying to think about our individual and collective destination. We were thinking about a new way of writing. We were thinking about going back to the site of the wound. And, well, talking about the difficult dialogue, this is what we're going to do. So rest assured, because the dialogue was not difficult between Martine and I, and I'm sure that you will see that. And I think that the best way to get into the matter is actually to produce a dialogue and to have a dialogue. You know, this is a matter of communication. And, well, I have to say that the way we decided to proceed is the following. We have proposed to our interlocutor a text by Camus, which is related to the topic, and we have crossed our readings. I mean, in the reading that we make of that text. So, having said so, we do believe that this exchange that we will have will be then underlined by a dialogue that will come afterwards. Yes, we wanted to show you several texts by Camus because I think that they have an interesting scope and they will help shed a light on the difficulties to meet the author that we're facing today. So, the difficult dialogue, well, this is something that we can say about the world today. And we're facing so many fundamentalisms and terrorism and populist tentations and also identitary problems, all these fractures in the world, in our different societies. All of this is a threat to universalistic values and to the rights of each and every one to be different. And, of course, this is very much related to the possibility to have a dialogue, because a dialogue presupposes and assumes that there will be an exchange based on a minimum of values that are commonly shared before getting into the dialogue. And Franck Panay reminded us so yesterday when he was reading Camus, because the dialogue assumes that prior to the dialogue there must be a common place. There must be a place where the exchange of speeches and the exchange of discussions may lead to a dissonance that is recognized, and within that dissonance everybody will be able to listen to the resonances of the other. And Franck Panay even went further. He was talking about the polemic of that piece of music, and he said that, well, with that dissonance, maybe we are just opening a possibility for the other to gather in. And he was talking about a feeling rather than a conviction. But anyway, this reminds us of this dissonance. And I would like to say that I'm going to go even further. And I would say as well that assenting or asserting is sometimes not possible. And what would a society that is always assertive about everything, so how would such a society look like? It would be conformist, it would be almost totalitarian. But, well, let's talk about the possibility of dialogue. Yesterday we were talking about passing or going from the monologue to the dialogue, and then there was also another intervention which was very Camusian actually, which was a Camusian aspiration, well, going from the solidarity of the individual to the solidarity of society. And I would propose that we introduce another notion, another ideal in our endeavors, which would be hospitality. And this is as demanding as dialogue. Hospitality. As demanding as dialogue, but it does not require the same circumstances. I'm not talking about the hospitality, for instance, well, in this case, in this event, I'm thinking about a wider sense of hospitality, in the sense of a generosity towards the other. I mean, hosting the other and welcoming the other when the other is in distress, when the other is in an equal position. And when the other is under constraint, it's then that we must be able to welcome the other without letting the other deny what the other is. And it's then that the dialogue is possible. It's from that point and from that hospitality. And about broken hospitality, well, Camus has experienced this through an individual tragedy and a historical tragedy as well. And he symbolized this in the tear that he described of a colonial society. And he knew that very well. Society, the tear of a colonial society that was approaching the end. We have to say that today it doesn't feel that our society has been released from that past. I mean, we were saying before that it's not that we have all gone back to the place and the site of the wound. So this means that this is still provoking in all those societies which are living this drama. This is provoking new wounds and resentment. So I'm not proposing here to get far from the issues of our times, but I would like to propose an alternative reading of the last writings, fiction writings of Camus, The First Man, and Anne was talking about The First Man yesterday, and then also this collection of nouvelles, which is entitled Exile and the Kingdom. Well, I'm going to start with a passage from The First Man, and Anne Proutot was telling us yesterday that this was an unfinished story that was published 34 years after the death of Camus. So there's a part that has been written, and this would have never been published by the writer himself. And then there are some notes. I'm going to read a passage of the first written part. It would be the second part, according to the writer. And in this second part, there's a chapter that has a title that I'm going to try to reflect upon. It's called Obscure to Oneself. So I'm going to read an excerpt, but I will be interrupting myself because the characteristic of this writing, and Anne was telling us about this, the characteristic of The First Man is that, well, in any literature writing, the real is sublimed, but this is also underlined by a very important autobiographic part. And we can feel that the writer is just writing this all at once, and he's being left in his own emotions and memories, and actually there are sentences that are lasting for 3 pages, and I wouldn't like to inflict that upon you because, well, it would be full of resonances and dissonances. So I will be led to cut the text from time to time so that I can reflect on the meaning. So obscure to oneself. The writer has been talking about the wonders of this childhood in Algiers, and the family is poor, but there's a generosity of Algiers, this Mediterranean land. And now he's talking about the issue of getting closer to the other. And he's talking also about a colonial society, about a pluri-ethnic society. And he's talking from the eyes of a child, of a white child in that society, but a poor white child. I'm going to read. And this blind movement in him, yes, this obscure movement through all these years, was in tune with this immense country around him, of which, as a child, he had felt the weight with, the permanent danger, of which no one spoke, because it seemed natural, but that Jacques perceived, as if he were the first inhabitant or the first conqueror, arriving where the law of force still reigned and where justice was made to punish mercilessly what mortals had not been able to prevent. With around him this attractive and disturbing people, close and separate, whom one rubbed shoulders with throughout the days, and sometimes friendship was born or comradeship, and when evening came, they would nevertheless retire to their unknown homes where nobody ever entered. They were barricaded with their women that no one ever saw. Or if we saw them, we didn't know who they were because they were veiled in their face and they had a beautiful sensual face and soft eyes. And they were so numerous in the districts where they were concentrated. They were so numerous that by their sheer number, though resigned and tired, there was an invisible threat that one sniffed in the air of the streets some evenings. So this is how Camus describes his experience of a child, and he says that in the name of Jacques, and he who is anchored in a working class neighborhood in Algiers, and that's how he describes the relationship between the indigenous population and the European population, so the natives and the Europeans. So yes, here we recognize precisely the neighborhood of Bellecour, where Camus spent his childhood, and then he came back to this neighborhood year after year to see his mother. And this suburb is 3 to 4 kilometers south of Algiers, and it's just by the sea. And this neighborhood of Bellecour is organized, let's say, in an uncontrolled way. It organizes different workshops, different production sites, but also some homes. And actually, it is the only suburb, the only neighborhood in the city where you can find at the same time a predominance of European people from different origins, lots of Mediterranean people, but also, well, this population was coexisting and cohabiting with the natives. And I'm saying that they were coexisting. They were sharing the same neighborhood. They were neighbors, but they lived in separate places. I mean, they were separate, but still neighbors. And this explains that we're talking about this neighborhood of Bellecour and not the Kasbah, So this is where all these protests started, these marches and rallies, of spontaneous rallies of Muslim population. This is where they stem from, and they appear for the first time. And this is not the same as what other military combatants did afterwards. This is just some rallies that stem from popular aspiration. But I have to say that it is also in the neighborhood of Belcourt that in the 30s there were some militants, some activists from Algiers, and this is where the first strikes appear from the Front Populaire, from the Popular Front. This is where workers were rallied and were fighting for the first time with European workers as well. And just one final sentence, and I would like to say that in this very place, in this neighborhood, one could experience the separation, but at the same time this very fragile coexistence with this common experience and with a common hope as well for more equality between these two populations. And so, yes, there is this testimonial, that's right. And we see that, well, this is really interesting. And actually, Christian has just developed what leads to this possibility of socialization, whereas at the same time, there's the experience of this separation. So this is interesting. But what is also possible is to make a reading that will go further away. I mean, that will overcome, that will go beyond the colonial context. Actually, if you pay attention to the text, Camus does not talk about Belcourt. He talks about the poor neighborhood or the poor island. Camus is actually inviting the reader to think about the situation that he himself has experienced. And he actually talks about a situation that anybody else could have experienced, because he's just talking about a poor neighborhood. So he's talking about the tension of these populations which are coexisting but not in a crossed manner. And this is actually something that we could feel today when we think about what is imposed upon us in this authority. And, you know, it's like the other has appeared in our environment, because in the end, what happens in this colonial situation is just the difficulty to be associated with the other when the other is so close. So actually, this is just like this concerning strangity. So it's within this familiarity that we find this disturbing aspect. And I think that it is actually with this mutual perception that there is a European minority that is colonial at the same time. And we see that the other is close and is attracting, but at the same time, the other is separate and disturbing. So it's like coexisting in a kind of island within this very neighborhood, which is a poor neighborhood. And this coexistence may lead to some opportunities for exchange, for instance, at school or at the football field or in the workshops or other workplaces for the adults. But this also creates and cannot get rid of the suspicion that is entrenched. And this distrust, this suspicion is also entrenched, and it's not purged by a dialogue. And there's this confrontation that remains silent. I mean, nothing is ever said in this confrontation. And maybe the bodies speak, but they do so silently. And these bodies are just denying, instinctively denying the other. And then the other is interpreted as a kind of threat. And this is characteristic, you know, the face of the other remains closed to us. So in the unchanneled flow of writing, there is this draft of what the title announces. I mean, there's this part of obscurity, of darkness, that prevents us from understanding ourselves. And actually, this does not predispose to dialogue. It does not predispose to understand the other. So with this excerpt that I read, you can see that there's the appreciation of the other, but in a confused way. And the excerpt suggests as well that this darkness is full of impulses, and we see that for Camus, this has to be overcome by education, actually. This is what the text calls what we could say. He talks about the manners or the habits, actually. It's the manners and the habits that have to fight against this suspicion towards the other. And actually, Martine has just read this testimonial of a historical moment, but I think that it has a universal scope. Anyway, this excerpt that Martine has read is testifying to the constitutive difficulty to the relationship with the other in colonial Algeria. And I would like to draw your attention here, and I would like to warn you against a misunderstanding by the reader in this fiction text, actually, because sometimes, well, fiction text may lead to this kind of misunderstandings. Here we're talking about a fiction that is inspired by autobiography, and Proto talked about this yesterday. And yeah, this reminds us of the foundational experience, and it tells us about how harsh the social existence is in this kind of Algeria in those times. I mean, he's talking about the poorest of the poor, and they don't even have this elementary dignity. But the text is fiction anyway, and this means that we shouldn't try to seek in this description to the relationship to the other, we shouldn't try to seek the analysis that Camus writes in the 50s. Because what he writes then in the 50s, he writes about the social and individual reality of the Algerians of his time. And the text talks about a certain person called Jacques. And then we move from this Jacques as a child, and then we move to Jacques, which becomes a third person, just a third person, on in French. And this is the collective third person. And this means that we can only make the history from the eyes of this child. And the child sees an accumulation of fears and prejudices, ethnical prejudices, that come from the Algerians of the time of this decolonized mass. And 20 years later, he is quite aware of what such an opinion could lead. It would be like a blind opinion. So we could think that, well, this opinion is summarized with this kind of psychosocial precision. So it is in the writing that we have to find a certain critical distance, and we cannot ignore that. Now, for my part, I would propose to listen to an excerpt that constitutes the central scene of this short story from The Exile and the Kingdom. And this is significantly entitled The Guest, l'hôte, or the host. This time, the story depicts the face-to-face encounter between a school teacher from the Highlands called Daru, and we will see what this name is how this name is related to Camus, and an Arab. And we're not going to talk about the Arab mentioned as an Arab, but we're going to talk about an Arab because we want to preserve the status of anonymity. And this Arab is the author of a family murder, a quite cruel family murder. And Daru has been convicted in order to receive the punishment, actually. So this school teacher will be undergoing this. And I'm going to read. When he handed the glass of tea to the prisoner, Daru hesitated in front of his tied hands. But Daru put the glass on the floor and knelt down next to the Arab. The latter, without saying anything, watched him with feverish eyes. With his free hands, he rubbed his swollen wrists together, took the glass of tea, and sucked the hot liquid in quick sips. I'm going to talk about this part, and I'm going to read back again. This is a silent scene, and this is a scene depicting gestures and looks and gazes. So there's Daru and the Arab, and there's the master and the slave. And this is quite a symbolic scene that talks about an event that happened in the past during the 30s, an event that became a scandal, actually, that made a lot of turmoil. And Camus, as a good journalist, actually, he knew about this turmoil. And this comes from a crime. And the convicted person had to cover 70 kilometers on foot in tied hands. And this is how the Arab, who did not cover that distance, had been given to Daru with his tied hands. So the scene goes on. Are you hungry? Yes, said the prisoner. Daru set 2 place settings. He took flour and oil. He kneaded a cake in a dish. And when the cake was cooked, he cooled it on the windowsill. He did some condensed milk with water and bet the eggs into an omelette. He gave the light and served the Arab. He said, "Eat." The other took a piece of cake, put it quickly in his mouth, and stopped. And he said, "What about you?" He says, "Well, after you, I will eat too." The big lips opened a little. The Arab hesitated, and he bit resolutely into the cake. When the meal was over, the Arab looked at the teacher. "Are you the judge?" "No, I'll keep you until tomorrow." "Why are you eating with me?" "I'm hungry." And the other remained silent, and Daru got up and went out. He brought a cot from the lean-to, and between the table and the stove, perpendicular to his own bed. He took a suitcase that stood in the corner. He used it as a file shelf. He pulled 2 blankets. He stopped, felt idle, and sat down on his bed. There was nothing more to do or prepare. He had to look at this man. Now, to think about this excerpt, I would say that the day after that, Daru cannot take the convicted person to the police station. he cannot betray what he's entitled to do, what he's meant to do. So he has to face two different choices. But out of choice or by mistake, he takes the path towards the city and leads the other to prison. So then he just denies the other path, the path that would lead him to nomads. Nomads which would have welcomed the other one with no question. So the teacher is saved, and but he's at the same time twice condemned. He's condemned because he's betrayed his own community, and he's also condemned by the natives, because the natives during his absence have written in the classroom that you have betrayed, you have given our brother, so you will pay for it. And in this vast country that he loved so much, he was alone.
So such a statement of failure is all the more radical because the guest does not refer to the horrors of war specific to the period of 1954 to 1962. The war is obviously what destroys human lives, and it's against life and the humanity of a space. And this is the decolonization period that has been the longest and the most violent, until the humanity itself of participants that was not recognized as a war, but it was lived as a legitimate struggle, battle to recover the land by colonization. And then on the other hand, it was also considered as a way to maintain order, but they could emancipate from the laws that the international community could impose, facing the traumas of last century and the exercise of war. And this led to killings with a terrible violence, and including torture, terrorist attacks, and everything we already know well. So there's this chronological mistake or false sense where we have the adaptation of the film by David Hoffman, where we have this remake of this notebook, and this is these two men. And it's quite interesting because in the second part, which is quite long, there is a sort of a remake of Avoir 20 ans dans les Aurès, so being 20 in the Aurès, this film from 1972. And this was a real story of a parachute soldier who organizes escape of a prisoner. And this is a story that ends up with the separation of the two men, each of them going towards a different destiny, probably loneliness. And this story was, in fact, conceived before the beginning or entering the War of Independence, and it doesn't symbolize the horrors of that war, although it seems to anticipate them. But it actually symbolizes the difficult daily coexistence of the communities during the last period of the French Algeria. So Camus faces this inhumanity of war, and he expresses the awareness of finiteness of the colonization society through this specific form. And this is the product of the colonization by settlement. More than the conquering missions coming from the north with the weapons, reaching the territories where they want to perpetuate their presence and domain. So it's not weapons carried by soldiers, but the political oppression, misery and need. So there are several populations that have come or have been invited to come to this land that wasn't theirs, and it was never going to be theirs, and they were aware of that in a certain way, and they were coming from other countries, but this was continued in this wide land. The inhabitant is alone, and Camus is symbolizing here a story of values, of sadness of those inhabitants of the land that cannot enjoy their land, but it's also the sadness of unhappiness of all those who were there. So this is why the title of this story symbolizes the tragic and absurd of human condition. So a kingdom that we never reach, and this sends human beings to exile and loneliness. And here this has a historical perspective, because these several generations of Europeans and Mediterraneans in general, coming from different regions, including the Maones, they were called, who were people coming from this island, from Minorca. So they were reaching this land, and it wasn't their land, therefore they didn't understand it. And the idea was to create a kingdom that could have lasted if it had been based on a fraternity, but in fact just led from exile to exile. And they were, in each generation, they had to reinvent this land and this kingdom. So we have this relationship to identity, where they recognize themselves. And Camus, in 1958, when he wrote the preface, Betwixt and Between, well, he's already expecting another and final exile. So this impasse is all the more tragic because each one experiences the impossibility of really overcoming in a double acceptance of the other, and by the other, the collective barrier of this colonial inequality. Also, from this almost evangelical scene of hospitality, the dialogue is reduced to the expression of the most frugal and imperious of human needs. So the scene opens with this question from the teacher to the Arab, "Are you hungry?" And the improvised meal closes with, "I am hungry." that Derrida uses to refer to himself, to explain what has brought them together in spite of everything, of what's going on at that moment. Beyond the sharing of tea and cake, everything in fact separates irreparably these two men. The teacher has material security, knowledge. He's also has the power of authority in spite of himself. And then on the other hand, we have misery, ignorance, forced submission to the other. And Derrida feels an alien, facing the absurdity of the prisoner's crime. And the prisoner is alien to the law that seeks his punishment. Also, it is in the incomprehension that the captive receives here this first elementary gesture of humanity, of which he is the receiver. Why do you eat with me? And this impossibility of getting along with each other points out to us the necessity as well as the difficulty of what is called the Mediterranean civilizations, the duty of hospitality, also referred to by the three monotheist religions. This is often emphasized in connection with the title of this story, the lot, the guest. The French language designates but this one and same word, both the one who gives, the host, and the one who is received, the guest. One does not know, therefore, if the story has as a main character the captive or the one who assures the guarding, or if it is alternatively focusing on one and the other. This strange bisemy of the term lot, well, as you know, this comes from the Latin word hospes, while other languages, Latin languages, wanted to distinguish between these two roles. In Italian, we have the same origin. Is it? Do you also have the ambiguity? Yes, but you have the ospitante and the ospitato. So it's usually the person who receives, but it can also be used in the other way. In Spanish, nevertheless, please correct me if I'm wrong, and the usage might be a bit different, but for what I know, we've got anfitrión for the host and the huésped for the guest, invitado. And in Catalan, anfitrió and convidat. For the translations into English, well, for them it's something impossible. I think that they solved it going through or turning, in fact, the Arab the main character of this story. Well, this is a paradoxy, because as you've seen it, the story starts with the teacher, and at the end we have was alone. So it's in fact very much from his point of view of the tragedy that it is told. So there's this ambiguity of the word host, hôte, that comes from Latin, but there's also another source of ambiguity received from Latin, and this is in the words hostis and hostia, which has led to the religious hostie en français, in French. So if we go back to the semantic nucleus, we see that hospes, hostis, there's also this possibility of meeting of the idea of the stranger that we fight against, that we receive. So we have hostis, the enemy, hospes, the host, or the guest. So this Latin origin of the words show that hospitality always rubs shoulders with hostility. And this corresponds to the constitutive fragility of this human relation itself, where the risk is never ruled out of a hostile return to the first strangeness separating the two participants. Hospitality is a dual relationship. But if dialogue supposes an egalitarian access of each speaker to the word, hospitality is by nature a relation of asymmetry, of disparity. One must welcome, and the other accepts this gesture or withdraws from it. The one in need, the other has the means to provide for him. One is from here, the other comes from elsewhere, geographically or socially. So we understand why this difficult relationship to otherness, to the other, can only be played out painfully between the two characters of Lot. The disparity, the dissymmetry that constitutes the relationship of hospitality is obvious from the opening of the story, where the teacher sees the gendarme, the police approaching, pulling his captive bound by a rope, and it goes. One was on horseback, the other one on foot. Daru was very aware of the simple facilities. He lived as a teacher with its plastered walls, its narrow couch, its white wooden shelves, its weekly supply of water and food. These were basic goods. And this is an exchange of inequality in Lot, and this is clearly shown. But hospitality is a sharing of roles that can be reversible. And in a country of colonization, one could wonder who could legitimately call themselves that they were from the land. The colonizer and the colonized were the ones who hosted the other. So we had the French that had been there for years, and then those who were modest, like the family, Camus family, the authority, and the other. But because even expropriated, it was on their lands they had always lived on, where the French had settled themselves. The ethnologist Germaine Tilton wrote "complementary enemies," and she understood with that a situation where the teacher would always be determined to hold on to his position because he was aware that his legitimacy could be challenged, and therefore Daru, were in this country it was cruel to live in, and who everywhere else felt exiled. He was concerned about the captive. Is he against us? I don't think so. The war hasn't started yet, but we still already feel that. And well, I don't think he's against us. It was a family crime that he had committed, but one never knows. So we come back to this lack of trust, this méfiance. So hospitality always remains crossed by an irreducible part of distrust of the other, by the risk of, or the supposition, or the fact of what could be happening. Is he attacked? Daru can not totally overcome the sudden anger that the crime of his prisoner inspires in him, not only against this man, but against all men. Within his community, he means, and their dirty wickedness, their tireless hatreds, their madness of blood. And when he questions him on the reasons of his act and asks him if he regrets it, his interlocutor looks at him, mouth open. Visibly, he does not understand. The insurmountable partition of their ethnic and social positions in Algeria of the time condemns by force the two men to misunderstanding and failure without all the material sharing of a moment of existence, letting them open to a true mutual acceptance. In this respect, the text invites us to recognize all the contradictory tensions that the exercise of the old duty of hospitality is still subject to in a world that more than half a century later has still not overcome the violence required by decolonization. But it also reminds those who are concerned that the dialogue can be restored, how much this duty constitutes its primary necessity. So I would like to insist on the fact that beyond the colonial context that is quite clear here, in this story, as Christian has just explained, there's a different story that would be leading to a temporal interpretation. Camus had considered other titles for this short story too, referring to the universal myths like the law. This story can also echo other works by Camus that illustrate the tragedy of human conditions, such as the play The Misunderstanding. This refers, it was in fact published in 1944, and there an innkeeper and her daughter murder a guest who spent the night in their inn because they do not recognize him as the son and brother who had returned anonymously from exile to surprise them. And they kill him without recognizing him because they don't even look at him in their haste to steal from him. So, when looking at this story and the one we are now analyzing, we see that this crime, this execution that is announced, but there's something going on there. During the period of time in Lot, where Daru has to have a relationship with the captive he's not looking at. So here we see something that goes beyond the colonial separations, and this means that the Lot takes a certain humanity. So before reaching to the conclusion, if we have time, because we still have a lot to go, I'd like to go back to what we see in the first man. If you continue reading this unfinished text beyond the pages that I referred to at the beginning and that refer to the childhood, then we have to go to the sketches, the part of the work that was not written by Camus, because he didn't have time, and to refer to the adulthood of Jacques Cormery, where he evoked a relationship that goes beyond the one we see in Lot, this friendship between a European and a native. So between Jack and an alter ego named Sadok. This is an Arab name that means wise. And this character can condense several of Camus' friends. So here we see that the situation that appears is explained by a true sharing, an intellectual training received by Sadok, who was franchised. So Agnès was one of the first to refer to the importance of these two elements of dialogue between Jack and Sadok. And there, this is a fragment in the sketches in the draft for the book. So here we have the two men in the mid-30s, and we understand that they've shared very briefly one same experience, a political experience, and that was Camus' experience while he briefly joined the Algerian Communist Party. And then later on he was expelled with a lot of violence just 2 years later, when he refused to show solidarity with the repression of the first nationalist activists of the Algerian people who defended independence. And Sadok, well, Camus was object of the orders of the Communist Party, and so there's Jack, so Camus himself condemns this, and considers that there were basic principles like solidarity and respect for the other. So these two men meet 20 years later, where the nationalist conscience has awakened in Sadok and makes him join the Phéline and accept its methods. At that time, Jack, like Camus himself, although convinced anti-colonialists, condemns the use of attacks that may hit civilians. So here we see an ethical and political opposition, and this is going to test their friendship. There's a political divergence that is initially overcome, and it is the virtue of hospitality which transcends any other law and ensures to the one who is in danger a saving and unconditional shelter. So we can see here, well, I don't want to interpret a draft, because Camus left it as a draft, but we are going to go over this small scene.
Last conversation with Sadok, when Jacques is already against terrorism, but he welcomes Sadok, the right to asylum being sacred, at his mother's house. Their conversation takes place in front of his mother. At the end, "Look," says Jacques, pointing to his mother. Sadok gets up, goes to his mother, hand on his heart, to kiss his mother while bowing to the Arab. Now, Jacques has never seen him make this gestures because he is Frenchified. "She is my mother," he says. "Mine is dead. I love her and I respect her as if she were my mother." So this is interesting. And what's interesting here in these notes is that there is in brackets a sentence which says, "She fell because of an attack. She is ill." So he has already thought about underlining that scene pronounced, and these will lead to the bursting of this relationship, which resisted first of all, and this is related to the violence that has been exercised in the streets of Algiers. And actually, this could be related to the mother of Camus. And Anne was saying yesterday how important it was, but in the literary sublimation, the mother has become the symbol of the population of this little white population who was at the border of the situation. So we see that this excerpt may explain the object of that sentence that Camus was saying. You know, in Stockholm, he pronounced this sentence, and he said, yeah, I would like to give you this answer, literally, because we often find the sentence actually, but misguiding sentence. So I'm going to read the sentence pronounced in Stockholm in 1957 about the possibility to rally the cause of the Liberation Front. So he says, and this is what Camus says regarding the excerpt of the first man. I have always condemned terror. I must also condemn the terrorism that is blindly exercised in the streets of Algiers, and that one day it can strike my mother or my family. I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice. So what do we have to think about this sentence, which is so important given the context? I mean, the writer condemns any violence that would harm civilians like his mother, even in the name of a just cause. So you can criticize, you can argue, you can propose another point of view, but we have to recognize that the writer has this logic to defend man taken in their value as human beings. And this is symbolized by the mother, because the mother is the incarnated innocence. So actually you must privilege what is human, even though there may be the possibility of an argument of universal justice. So within this scene of the first man, we understand that the words are important, but gestures as well, and the bodies speak in a different way. We see that there's a lot of drama in the scene. Jacques welcomes the one who's running away from police, and Sadok, for his part, shows in an Oriental, in an Eastern way, but he shows his affection for the French mother. So in this scene, there is this kind of Creole convergence. There's the convergence of the one towards the other. There's a sharing of certain values, and these could even overcome a political disagreement. I mean, it could persist in spite of the political disagreement. So Jacques is against violence, but he can approve the methods of the other when needs be. But we see that, well, Camus does not always remain in this position, and there are certain scenarios that are less optimistic. There is actually a scene where friendship bursts, and then there's the logic of conflict that separates both characters. And the ferocity of the conflict in Algeria reaches a point of no return that just forces one to choose a side without any possibility of nuance. I mean, there is no more room for an independence fighter who's not a fan of violence against civilians than for a progressive who is ready to understand it. Actually, I have another excerpt, a very brief one, So there are two sentences here that show this. It says, "Stay, they will take you." This is obviously Jacques speaking to offer refuge to Sadoc, who's wanted by the police. And Sadoc answers, "It's better then. It's better them I can hate, and I join them in hatred. You are my brother, and we are separated." So you see that here there is a pessimism which shows that in spite of the path that they have covered to meet somehow, in spite of the years of friendship, in spite of certain common criteria, war can inflict this separation. And then there is another excerpt that I would like to read for you. And it may sound like an anecdote, but to me, it really shows these values. It says, "But why marry like this, Sadoc? Do I have to get married the French way, French style or otherwise? Why do you submit to a tradition that you consider foolish and cruel?" Addition in the margin of the page. The writer foresees this, how to develop this anecdote. He says, and this is a terrible sentence by Sadoc, and this shows how Camus can give and pay attention to the word of the other. So this is Sadoc who says, "The French are right, but their being right oppresses us. And that's why I choose the Arab madness, the madness of the oppressed." Of course, here we're talking about an exchange, which is a possible exchange, and words can prove only that there's a refusal to approach. There is the deny of a cultural approach that would be the proof of cultural values, ensuring freedom and equality to all human beings, and a return for a brutal tradition, the tradition, for instance, of forced marriage that is contrary to Sadoc's deepest convictions. But this is imposed, actually, and this will allow him to form a cultural bloc with his people. So the friendship shatters at this point, and friendship becomes a hatred that is all the more stronger that the two men had been able to have a dialogue and a rapprochement in the past, conducted in equality, and actually spells out this kind of changes in the relationship. Because this is what he has witnessed. He has witnessed the eruption of hateful passions, and he has tried and seek to fight against this eruption with no success. So 6 decades after such a conflict, the time has come to finally overcome the difficulty of dialogue between two peoples who were long linked by common history. This was the French Algeria. Now, I will not dwell on the turbulences of the relationship between both states. There are so many official positions in this area which actually are full of connivances. So for each state, I'm not going to talk about what the states did. There's always the political legitimization with regard to internal opinions. So I will rather draw attention to the public tension on both sides. And this is shown from one side and from the other in a defensive conception, in an integrist or fundamentalist conception of what we call identity or national unity. On one of the shores, there's denial for more than half a century. There's the denial of the diversity of languages, diversity of beliefs diversity of identities in the name of this Arab identity that seems to be exclusive and very conservative of the state religion. And on the other side, there is a state that throws the possibility of a suspicion of an Islam of Latvian origin, and there's the specter of separatism or of an invasion, and there's the suspicion on a whole population of citizens of Muslim origin that have been born through several generations from a colonizing power and from an immigration economy. And these are symmetrical closures. And actually, it's just like a sign of war, actually. And it is upon this failure of a nation, that comes the strength. It does not come from unanimity and exclusion, but there's now a democratic dialogue and a social solidarity. And the absurd attempt to stigmatize the vast population of binationals who live in France. And this is one of the best vectors of a true dialogue between cultures. But in order not to remain within such a pessimistic observation, I'm going to have a reading.
Alors, qu'est-ce que je vous dis? Je voudrais juste vous dire une phrase.
Okay, so I know that I have very little time. I would just like to say one thing. There is the final failure of this friendship, but we can see how this forced sharing with the captive has led to a kind of irritation towards himself. Daru is irritated towards himself, and there's this kind of fraternity. It's the soldier and the prisoner. They're both forced to sleep together, and actually they're within the same community of reflection and fatigue. I know that we have philosophers in the audience, but we wanted to conclude on the fact that Camus is within the same lines as the philosopher Derrida, and we see that these can be reflected from very specific situations. Derrida, when he talks about hospitality, goes beyond what Linas was saying. He says, well, the other has a face. I mean, the other becomes human. And Derrida used to say, yeah, we have to recognize humanity in the other, even if the other looks dark, or even if we cannot see through the other, even if there is no possibility to approach the other. So Camus is within these lines. He thinks about the relationship with the other. He respects how strange the other may be. He knows that the other may have another motivation. He respects that difference. But what's important is that there is something essential that has made one and the other recognize each other as human beings. And I think that this is precisely what's important. And we must recognize in Camus his willingness to illustrate his philosophical thought, deploying this in different registers, within novels, but also within the theater. And theater is a place for incarnation. It's a place where people play a role, and there can be two bodies that recognize each other. And that's why these texts, years afterwards, even if they're not in the same historical context, these texts do have an echo on us, because these texts allow us to think of dialogue, and they deserve a response. These texts are telling us, look, this is what we were, this is what we expect, this is how we see the other. And I think that this is a real invitation to dialogue. And Camus used to think that besides philosophy, literature has this power to dialogue, even though the dialogue is within an impasse, even if the dialogue is historically interrupted. So we see through all these texts that the dialogue is mandatory. We see that even in dissonance, there must be a dialogue. And thoughts are obliged to think about the other. And yeah, that's it for us. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Désolée d'avoir coupé, disons, la parole.
I am so sorry to interrupt you, to interrupt the dialogue, and I know that you know, if we want to be generous towards everybody, we had to interrupt this dialogue. But I think that this final conclusion, this final summary, really shows what you wanted to tell us. Thank you very much. I'm going to now let some minutes so that the others can prepare to take the floor. Thank you very much. So don't leave the room, please.